maybe be a few minutes late, but we'll get started. So I'm pleased to have Dr. Mendoza from the FDA visiting us today. So this is part of the Centers for Excellence for Regulatory Science and Innovation that Mayo Clinic has jointly with Yale University. And part of that is the Visiting Scientist program, where we have the opportunities to invite scientists from the FDA to come visit us, and we were able to get Martin to come here. Dr. Mendoza serves as the Director of Extramural Research for the Office of Minority Health in the Office of the Commissioner at the FDA. And as Director of Extramural Research Program, he oversees all the Office of Minority Health research programs with the different Centers for Excellence in Regulatory Science and Innovation. He has also spoken before the Congress in support of Office of Minority Health programs and mission, and has authored numerous congressionally mandated reports, and also primary author of the FDA Guidance on Collection of Race and Ethnicity Data in Clinical Trials. So there's a number of things, additional things I can speak about Martin, and but I think he has great insights on where FDA is going, especially in terms of engaging broader populations and trials that are fundamental to approval of drugs and devices. So I'll turn it over to you, Martin. Thank you again for coming.
Thanks, Neely. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to Neely and the Mayo Clinic. I think one of the things I've just been really shocked is the weather here. It is cold. It is bone-chilling cold. and from what I understand, it only gets colder. So luckily I'll be flying out later today, so I can defrost the rest of this weekend. So thanks again for the invitation. And so today I want to give you an FDA perspective on clinical trial inclusion and demographics. So some of the challenges and opportunities that we've faced at FDA. So just a little bit of disclosure information. So I'm not going to discuss any off-label use or investigational use. The views expressed here are mine and not necessarily FDA's. And unfortunately, I have no financial relationships to disclose. So I know everyone here is familiar with FDA's, but with what FDA does. But I thought just to make sure everyone's on the same page, I'd just give you a brief 1 to 2 slide overview of FDA's mission. So FDA protects and promotes the public health by ensuring the safety, efficacy, and security of drugs, biologics, and medical devices, our nation's food supply, cosmetics, and products that emit radiation. We oversee a portfolio of products worth about $2 trillion a year, which is approximately a fifth of consumer spending. We help the public get accurate science-based information they need. And most recently, we've been tasked with regulating the manufacturing, marketing, and distribution of tobacco products. So I want to talk a bit about globalization, because this will become a theme later on in the talk. So as far as foods go, about 10 to 15% of all the food consumed by U.S. households is imported, and that's been increasing at about a rate of about 10% per year. For devices, 50% is imported, and that's also growing at about a rate of 10% per year last time we looked at that systematically. And drugs, 40% come from overseas. And something that was really striking to me that I did not know prior to joining FDA was about 60% of the data that FDA reviews from clinical trials that data is from clinical trials that are submitted outside the U.S., so 60%, which I thought was just really astounding. So moving on to the topic that I'm here to discuss today, so minorities in clinical trials. And first I want to talk to you about why this is important, so building a case for increased participation. So when we look at the U.S. population, it's composed of approximately 12% African Americans and 17% Hispanics. But when we look at their inclusion rates in clinical trials, we see in those trials conducted by industry, African Americans only account for about 5%, in industry trials and Hispanics at 3%. NIH does better at 15% and 7.6% respectively, but considering NIH trials only account for about 10% of all clinical trials, that still leaves a lot to be desired. So looking at some additional racial and ethnic groups, so women, they're not doing too bad as far as inclusion in clinical trials goes, 46%. As I just showed you, African Americans at 8%, Asians 12%, and of course Caucasians, no issue there at 76%. Now, if you recall earlier, I was talking about globalization. So here's why that's important. So I'm going to use prostate cancer as an example. So if we look from 1993 through 2004, 40%, roughly half of those patients that were enrolled in clinical trials came from the U.S. And then when we look at a later time point between 2006 and 2014, we see that percentage drop, quite dramatic drop from 29.2%. And then when we look at the other areas, Australia, Europe, United Kingdom, we see their percentages move higher into as in the later time point. So why is that important? So it's globalization. As I mentioned earlier, trials are being conducted more and more outside the U.S. And keep in mind, the U.S. approves medical products for the U.S. population. So in essence, we're approving products for the U.S. population based more and more on data that's coming from outside the U.S. And as we all know, the U.S. has a very diverse population, and some of these other areas listed on here are not so diverse. So I think it's fair to say that this is becoming more and more of an issue. So why is participation important? Obviously health disparities continue to exist. We need representation from these minority groups so that we can study the effects of medical products in the people that will ultimately need and use them. And obviously minorities can respond differently to medical products. So here are some examples, and I apologize for the small text, but just for example, the anticonvulsant carbamazepine. There is on the FDA label, there is a box warning for Asians. They may experience increased incidence of adverse events due to the presence of the HLA-B1502 allele in certain Asian populations. ACE inhibitors. These may not be, some of them may not be as effective for African American populations. So there's recommendations for considering alternative therapies to particular ACE inhibitors. The drug used in transplants, tacrolimus, a higher dose in African Americans in African American transplant patients is recommended. So these are just a couple of the examples that we found when we did a systematic review of FDA-approved drugs between 2008 and 2013. And to summarize, we found that within these drugs that we reviewed in this review, about a fifth of them had indications on the FDA label for specific racial and ethnic minority populations. So why don't minorities participate in clinical trials? Well, there's a number of reasons. There is historical issues, historical abuses. Tuskegee, Henrietta Lacks, I'm sure everyone here is familiar with these examples. There's inadequate recruitment and retention efforts, misunderstanding of these underrepresented populations' beliefs and values. There's a perception that minorities are ineligible for enrollment or that they simply do not want to participate. There's a lack of awareness on the patient's part, and this is also related to their interactions with the physicians, as oftentimes physicians may have certain biases, or they may just not have time to approach the patient about participating in a clinical trial, just due to the other responsibilities they have. But what does industry actually think about minority participation in clinical trials? So this is a slide I borrowed from Quintiles. There was a study done on behalf of pharma. So what this slide is basically showing is that what they did is they looked at some of their type 2 diabetes trials, and they simulated using some algorithm and modeling techniques to see what it would take to increase minority participation in clinical trials and to increase their numbers to the point where you get on your x-axis here, match the subgroup population, and then powered, getting statistical power. And so what they basically found using their modeling techniques, which I don't necessarily agree with, are that if you want to power your trial for these to look for subgroup differences, it's going to increase the length of your enrollment. Again, this is not based on what I'm showing here is not based on actual trial enrollment, but a modeling technique they used based on data that didn't enroll minorities. So, but what does the research actually show? So, what it shows is that in general, minorities will participate if they are asked, but oftentimes they simply are not. So one study showed that 91% of African Americans who were surveyed, they would absolutely consider participating in a clinical trial, and that mistrust is becoming less of an issue. Similar numbers for Latinos at 71%. Another study showed that no difference between African Americans and Hispanics as far as their willingness to participate when compared to Caucasians. Also that African Americans were less likely to be asked to participate in a specific breast cancer clinical trial compared to white women. But what we found at FDA is that when medical product sponsors, when they thoughtfully plan in advance for inclusion of these underrepresented populations, so before the first patient is even enrolled, when they come up with a plan that takes into account site selection, cultural competencies, other logistical concerns, there is little to no effect on trial enrollment duration. One specific example that we always point out is the Platinum trial by Boston Scientific, which is over 60-70% minorities. In this trial, they met their target enrollments easily, and they did it 6 months ahead of schedule, simply because they thoughtfully planned in advance. So we know it's possible to enroll minorities without increasing your enrollment period. So what are we doing to combat this lack of minorities in clinical trials? I want to talk about some of the efforts from my office, the FDA Office of Minority Health. So our vision is simply to create a world where health equity is a reality for all, and we do that based on 3 goals. So we want to improve and strengthen regulatory science information, informing the research and evaluation of subpopulation data. We want to strengthen FDA's capacity to address minority health across the agency. We also aim to promote effective communication and dissemination of information to the public, particularly those underserved and vulnerable populations. So what is my office's OMH, Office of Minority Health's role in this? So we see ourselves as conveners and connectors. So we connect the FDA centers and offices where these reviews of medical products occur. They might not necessarily know how to connect with patients and the advocacy groups, and so we serve as a link to minority serving organizations. So we develop relationships, and it's our job to know these organizations that will ultimately connect the FDA centers and offices with the patients and consumers that they are serving. So a couple of areas that our office focuses on, all the major disparate areas: cardiovascular, cancer, hepatitis, diabetes, sickle cell. We focus on language access with our language access plan, which involves outreach to low English proficiency populations, as well as clinical trials, which I will talk about more later on in the talk. So some of our outreach and communication strategies go into 4 main buckets. So stakeholder engagement. So we continually engage with minority serving institutions, patient and disease advocacy groups. We conduct webinars, external meetings, and participations. We aim to raise awareness through meetings, speaker series. We do a monthly newsletter with several tens of thousands of recipients, email blasts, blogs, and consumer updates. We're active on social media, Twitter, Pinterest, Facebook. We do targeted consumer education, so materials development, fact sheets, infographics, videos, brochures. We translate and adapt materials for those low English proficiency populations to make sure that that the materials that FDA disseminates are in plain, easy to understand language. So now I want to turn to a piece of legislation that is pretty significant as far as informing the work that my office does. It's called the FDA Safety and Innovation Act, so FDAs for short, of 2012, and this is Section 907. So the history behind this piece of legislation is that several advocacy groups, so the American Heart Association, Women's Heart, they lobbied Congress to produce legislation that required FDA to report data on the inclusion analysis of women in these FDA applications from medical product sponsors. And then Senator Benjamin Carnan from Maryland added a provision to include race and ethnicity reporting in there. So the final piece of FDA of FDAsia legislation, which reauthorized FDA user fees, so which is crucial to the operations of the agency, had 2 requirements. So the first was to do an initial public report on the inclusion data, so primarily women and minorities and age from our medical product applications. And then from that report, if any deficiencies were identified, we needed to come up with an action plan to address those deficiencies. So in August of 2013, we posted that report. It's currently available on the FDA website, and this report detailed the extent of the clinical trial participation by a demographic subgroup, so sex, age, race, and ethnicity in the applications submitted to FDA. And the report looked at the medical product applications in 2011. So again, apologize for the small text, but this table basically summarizes how we're doing as far as the demographics for race and ethnicity. So it's divided into 2 halves, and the first column in each table is your disease indication. So you have things like COPD, melanoma, prostate cancer, HIV, etc. So you can see in the first column that's labeled white, Caucasians. This group is obviously doing just fine. So you have inclusion demographics anywhere from 100 to 67%. So no problem recruiting Caucasians to our clinical trials, as everyone here knows. A second column, Black African Americans, shows a starkly different number. So you see numbers ranging anywhere from 23 to 0%, with most in the low single digits. Again, not so great. Asians doing marginally better, but not by much. Again, mostly in the low single digits. And then our quote unquote other group, which includes groups such as Hispanic or Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander, similar to the Black African Americans, with low single digits. So these are for FDA approved drugs in 2011. How about for our biologics? Again, you see similar numbers. So on the bottom, you see your disease indication. In the blue bar is your Caucasian percentages. So again, very high numbers of Caucasians. In the red is your African American numbers. As you can see, pretty low. Asians, also very low in the green. Hispanics in the yellow, very low as well compared to Caucasians. And how about by devices? So again, disease indication on the left. Blue bar indicates Caucasian. You can see most of these trials are primarily Caucasians enrolled. African Americans in red. Small numbers. Some of them not so bad, but mostly low numbers. Asians in green, and Alaska Natives in orange. So not so great. So again, these are numbers from 2011. So you might be thinking, well, that's 2011. There's been a big push since then. What are some of the newer pieces of data? Here's some updated data from 2015. Again, you see African Americans in the low single digits, Asians in doing slightly better, and then of course Caucasians making up most of the trial participants. Cardiovascular, similar trends. You see women doing okay, a bit of room for improvement, and African Americans again in the low single digits. So things haven't changed much over that time course. And again, psychiatric. So in this area, African Americans actually, the numbers aren't as stark as the previous slides, but still lots of room for improvement. So we have all these. We know what the problem is, but how we go about fixing it. So if you remember in that legislation, there was a requirement to come up with an action plan to address the deficiencies. So in August of 2014, FDA published that action plan, and it had 3 priorities. So priority 1 focused on quality, so improving the quality of our demographic subgroup data collection, reporting, and analysis. Priority 2 focused on participation. So we needed to identify barriers why minorities weren't enrolled in clinical trials and come up with strategies to combat that. And priority 3, focus on transparency, so making this data more available and transparent. So I'm going to go through each of the priorities. So right now I'm going to talk about priority 1, data quality. So in October of 2016, I authored an FDA guidance document. And for anyone not familiar with what an FDA guidance document is, an FDA guidance document provides FDA's current thinking or policy on a particular topic or issue, and these guidance documents tend to be closely looked at by industry. So the title for this particular guidance document, Collection of Race and Ethnicity Data in Clinical Trials. So in the guidance document, I talk about clinically relevant enrollment. And there are 2 main things that this guidance document tries to convey. The first is an expectation by FDA that sponsors enroll participants that reflect the demographics for clinically relevant populations with regard to age, gender, race, and ethnicity. So basically what FDA is saying is that the people that sponsors enroll in their clinical trials should match the disease prevalence for which that medical product is intended to treat. And this is new language for FDA, which has never been so clearly stated before. The second recommendation within this guidance document is that medical product sponsors should include a plan to address inclusion of clinically relevant subpopulations, and that this plan needs to be submitted to FDA at the earliest stages of development. So that means for drugs and biologics, no later than the end of the phase 2 meeting. What we've often found is that sponsors leave this plan for inclusion either completely out or it's not addressed until we're far along into the clinical trial when it's too late to adjust enrollment demographics. So we're saying here that we expect this plan to be submitted early on in the development process because as I've talked about earlier, when that's done, when a plan is included early, what we found is that there is little to no effect on enrollment as far as lengthening the duration of enrollment. So that was priority one, looking at data quality. Priority two, participation. So identifying barriers to subgroup enrollment to employer strategies to encourage greater participation. So how have we gone about doing that? So in 2016, our former commissioner, Robert Califf, declared 2016 the year of clinical trial diversity. And this was an FDA-wide effort. So the campaign for this effort, its purpose was to develop a multimedia campaign to raise awareness around the importance of minority representation in clinical trials to ensure medical products are safe and effective for everyone. So what are the motivators? What were we hoping to accomplish? We wanted to add positive reinforcement as to why clinical trial diversity matters, educate consumers about clinical trials, and also help stimulate dialogue. We developed several campaign materials which are all available on our website. So we had 5 public service announcements featuring a patient rep and also featuring our FDA chief scientist. We have printed materials on our website, so brochures, fact sheets, blogs, newsletters, and e-alerts. Social media, Twitter, Facebook, Pinterest. We have a web page that hosts a stakeholders communication toolkit dedicated to minorities in clinical trials that is free to download. So if anyone is looking to enroll more minorities in your clinical trials, please feel free to use this toolkit. We had a dissemination and promotion period. So this ran from June 13th through June 27th of 2016. It coincided with World Sickle Cell Awareness Day. We distributed via email our toolkit to our stakeholders, and we conducted social media outreach during this campaign. So this involved what's called a Google AdWords YouTube campaign. And so it used quote-unquote in-display ads. So these are ads that appear within YouTube, web and mobile search results, as well as the Google Display Network. So this is a screenshot of a video called Shirley's Story. And I just want to see if it doesn't work, I will. Well, I guess it's not working. So I'll just go back to the presentation. Oh, maybe that will work.
I'm Shirley Miller, and I have sickle cell disease. In order to help researchers find better therapies and treatments for my condition, I have chosen to participate in clinical trials, as well as encouraging my peers to participate. I learned about clinical trials by attending public meetings, talking to my doctor, and visiting clinicaltrials.gov to search for open clinical trials. You too can be a part of the greater good to help advance medical care. Go to clinicaltrials.gov to find out more.
So that was just one of the videos that our group produced. We produced 5 of them. So what were the results of our Google YouTube AdWords campaign? Before I get to those numbers, just a couple of quick terminologies. So I'm going to talk about impressions. So this is the number of times the ad displays in YouTube. There's no cost for this. View rate, the number of times the ad is clicked divided by the number of times it was seen, and the cost per view. So in terms of the videos, the ad campaign ran from June 12th to June 27th. So you can see that the videos had 4 out of 5 of them had views in the 300 to 400 range, but we chose to specifically promote one of our videos through this Google YouTube AdWords campaign, and that significantly boosted its viewership to 6182. And that was the video you just saw. As far as the ad performance goes, we had about 7.3 million impressions with 5,500 views, a view rate of about 0.08%, average cost about $1.89, giving us a total cost for this campaign of about $10.5 thousand. You can see here some of the numbers from our from the videos. So again, we had about 6,100 for the views for the video that we chose to promote. As far as the breakdown, about 50% of those that viewed it were female, 43% were male. Unfortunately, Google does not track race, ethnicity as far as who clicked on the video. And then most people watched the video for about 15 seconds before moving on. So as far as this campaign goes, again, it was to look at promote clinical trial diversity, increase utilization of our materials like our videos and our toolkit. And as far as next steps go in this campaign, we are currently shooting a video, PSA, public service announcement, educating Latinos about the importance of participating in clinical trials, as well as targeting physicians and how to engage their patients for participation. Okay, so I want to talk now about the third and final priority within our action plan. So priority 3, making demographic subgroup data more available and transparent, so transparency. So the main effort under this third action item, transparency, is called drug trial snapshots. So what drug trial snapshots are starting in 2015, FDA made an effort to publish in easy to understand language, bar graphs, pie charts, who participated in clinical trials, and if there were any differences observed by sex, age, and race. So these are just a couple of screenshots of the drug trial snapshots website, and you can see on the right hand side, the second half of the of that screenshot is where it starts to list the actual drug trial snapshots, where you can just click on the left-hand column and pull up whichever newly approved FDA drug you are interested in viewing. So again, some of the examples for what you can expect if you look at these snapshots. On the left is some of the plain, easy to understand language. It answers simple questions like, what is this drug for? How is it used? What are the benefits? One of the questions that we wanted answered the most was, were there any differences in how well a drug worked in clinical trials among sex, age, and race? So for this particular drug, Entresto, you can see that clearly answered questions. Sex, Entresto works similarly in men and women. Race works similarly in all races studied. Age works similarly in all age groups studied. So just plain, simple to understand English, clear answers. And then looking over to the various pie charts on your right, you can see, again, very simple to understand graphics. You can clearly see at the bottom graphic, as far as gender goes, 22% women, 78% men. And then moving on to your race and ethnicity demographics, you can see in this particular drug you had 66% Caucasians, and you can see the percentages for the other racial and ethnic groups. So again, very clear and easy to understand language. So just to quickly summarize what I've gone over today. So I've talked about why clinical trial participation is important. We've gone over some of the OMH, my office's policy efforts as far as our guidance document. And then I talked to you about some of our outreach with our Google, YouTube, AdWords campaign, our video, our communications toolkit, and as well as some of our transparency efforts with our drug trial snapshots. So I encourage everyone to stay connected with us. You can follow us on Twitter, email us, visit our website, or join our webinars and stakeholder calls.